In early 1943, Japan faced a crisis that threatened to unravel its entire position in the Pacific. Their troops in New Guinea were isolated, cut off from reinforcements, food, and ammunition. The Allied forces were pressing closer every day, and Japanese supply lines were under constant threat. For the Japanese commanders, time was running out. Every delay, every lost shipment risked entire divisions collapsing under relentless pressure. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. To address this dire situation, the Imperial Japanese Army devised a bold plan. A large convoy would sail across the treacherous waters of the Bismarck Sea, carrying thousands of soldiers, weapons, and vital supplies directly to the port of Lae. This was no ordinary mission. It was a gamble, a high-stakes push into enemy-controlled waters, relying on speed, coordination, and heavy protection of escort destroyers. On paper, it seemed feasible. The Japanese believed their ships, tightly organized and moving swiftly, could outmaneuver any potential threat. They were confident that the convoy would reach Lae intact, delivering reinforcements just in time to bolster their embattled troops. But confidence can be dangerous in war. The Japanese underestimated one vital factor. The Allies were already watching. Intelligence networks, reconnaissance flights, and code-breaking operations had revealed almost every detail of the convoy's plans. American and Australian forces were preparing a trap unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. Every radio transmission, every unusual ship movement, every patrol in the region was monitored with meticulous precision. The Allies had calculated the convoy's route, its timing, and its likely weaknesses. In other words, Japan was sailing directly into the teeth of a plan that would exploit their every assumption. Meanwhile, aboard the convoy's transport ships, the atmosphere was calm, almost routine. Soldiers huddled in the holds, checking their gear and sharing quiet conversation. Officers walked the decks, adjusting charts and calculating arrival times. Sailors tightened ropes and watched the waves, unaware that the calm waters were about to be shattered by violence. In the vast expanse of the Bismarck Sea, everything appeared normal. The sky was a blank canvas, hiding the approaching storm. Clouds drifted lazily above, masking the deadly silhouettes of Allied aircraft poised for attack. Japanese commanders placed their trust in numbers and coordination. The fleet consisted of dozens of transport ships, each carrying hundreds of troops and tons of essential supplies. They were escorted by well-armed destroyers and warships, vessels that could fend off attacks from submarines or enemy surface ships. Yet what they did not fully appreciate was the destructive potential of coordinated air power. The concept of massed air attacks against naval convoys was still relatively new, and Japan had limited experience in defending against it. The men aboard the convoy had trained for naval skirmishes, for submarine threats, even for sudden encounters with surface raiders, but they had not trained for the sky to become a battlefield. Even as the convoy sailed forward, tension simmered under the surface. Some officers noticed distant shadows on the horizon, unusual patterns in the clouds, or fleeting shapes in the water, but most dismissed them. They assumed the vastness of the sea would protect them. Yet the Allies were patient hunters. They had positioned their aircraft high above, waiting for the perfect moment. Every ship, every engine, every movement of the Japanese convoy was observed. What seemed like routine naval maneuvers was in fact a countdown to disaster. The plan was audacious, but the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers were confined to cramped spaces, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Supplies that could determine the survival of entire divisions were packed tightly in the holds, ready to be lost in a single devastating blow. For the Japanese, this was more than a mission. It was their lifeline. Success meant survival, reinforcement, and maintaining control over a critical front. Failure would mean not only the loss of ships and men, but the unraveling of their strategic position in New Guinea. As the convoy pressed onward, the men aboard each ship could not yet imagine what was coming. Within a few days, the skies above the Bismarck Sea would erupt with fire and explosions. Planes armed with bombs and machine guns would descend in precise formations, striking at the heart of the convoy. Transport ships would ignite, destroyers would struggle to respond, and the sea would be transformed into a scene of chaos and terror. The mission that began as a calculated reinforcement operation was about to become one of the most devastating naval disasters of the Pacific War. In the end, the Lae Convoy disaster was not just a battle of ships and troops, it was a clash of strategy, intelligence, and technology. It would demonstrate the lethal potential of air power over traditional naval forces, changing the way wars were fought at sea. But for now, the men of the convoy sailed onward, unaware that history was about to be written in flames. Every wave, every gust of wind, every passing shadow was a prelude to a catastrophe that would claim thousands of lives in a matter of minutes. And within this fragile moment of calm, the stage was set for 15 minutes of fire that would alter the course of the Pacific War forever. By the time the Japanese convoy left its port, the Allies already knew it was coming. American and Australian intelligence had intercepted radio transmissions, decoded Japanese messages, and tracked ship movements across the Bismarck Sea. Every signal was a piece of the puzzle, and the Allies had assembled it with deadly precision. For the Japanese, the ocean seemed empty and vast. For the Allies, it was a stage, carefully prepared for one of the most devastating ambushes in the Pacific. High above the clouds, reconnaissance planes had already spotted the fleet. Observers noted the composition of the convoy, counted the transport ships, and measured the number of destroyer escorts. Even minor deviations from expected formations were recorded and analyzed. This was not a guesswork attack. Every detail, every ship, every movement had been mapped. The Allies were preparing to strike with surgical accuracy. In Australia, intelligence officers briefed the pilots who would carry out the assault. They studied photographs taken by reconnaissance flights, memorized the convoy's likely route, and calculated the angles of approach that would maximize damage while minimizing risk. Skip bombing, strafing runs, and coordinated attacks were all part of a plan honed to perfection. Pilots were told to expect heavy anti-aircraft fire, but they also knew that speed, surprise, and coordination would give them the upper hand. Meanwhile, the men aboard the Japanese convoy continued their journey, unaware that the calm skies above were filled with unseen observers. Sailors adjusted sails, soldiers checked their weapons, and officers calculated arrival times as if this were any other voyage. They had trained for enemy ships, for submarines, even for storms, but they had never trained for what was about to come. From thousands of feet above, aircraft waited silently, hidden behind clouds, patiently watching and ready to strike. The intelligence work that led to this moment was meticulous. Codebreakers in Australia had been monitoring Japanese communications for months, tracking supply routes and troop movements. Any message hinting at reinforcements was noted, every delay in transmission analyzed. This was a chess game played on a grand scale, with the Allies always several moves ahead. They knew not just that the convoy existed, but roughly when and where it would sail, how many ships it carried, and how it would be defended. With this knowledge, the Allies could turn what might have been a routine Japanese resupply mission into a catastrophic disaster. At the same time, pilots were preparing for the attack of a lifetime. American B-25 bombers and Australian Hudsons were fueled, armed, and positioned for maximum impact. Low-flying fighter bombers were briefed on the dangers of anti-aircraft fire, but also on the potential rewards of precision attacks.
Every pilot knew that this mission could decide the fate of thousands of soldiers, both friend and foe. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity. The stage was set over the Bismarck Sea. Clouds hung low and thick, providing both cover and suspense. Below, the Japanese convoy sailed confidently, unaware that its every movement had been tracked, measured, and calculated by unseen eyes. Above, the Allies waited, their planes hidden by altitude and mist. The tension was almost palpable. Every passing minute brought the convoy closer to disaster. Every mile traveled made the coming ambush inevitable. And yet, even with all this preparation, the timing had to be perfect. The planes could not strike too early or too late. Any miscalculation could allow the convoy to slip through, or worse, expose the aircraft to unnecessary danger. Every element of the attack had to synchronize: the high-level bombers, the low-flying fighter bombers, the strafing runs, and the skip-bombing maneuvers. This was intelligence and strategy converging on a single target, a trap so precise that escape would be nearly impossible. For the Japanese, the ocean was still a seemingly safe passage. For the Allies, it was a battlefield waiting to erupt. Within hours, the calm of the sea would be shattered by bombs, fire, and chaos. The careful work of months, reconnaissance, code-breaking, planning, and training was about to collide with the bold confidence of Japanese commanders. What followed would demonstrate the terrifying power of modern air warfare and change naval strategy for years to come. The stage was now set. Above the Bismarck Sea, patience, planning, and technology waited silently. Below, thousands of soldiers and sailors moved unknowingly toward a fate they could not see. And in just a few hours, the skies would open with fury, marking the beginning of one of the most devastating air attacks in World War II.
The first hint of danger came as a distant shadow on the horizon, barely noticeable at first, like the flicker of a candle in a vast darkness. For the man aboard the Japanese convoy, it seemed insignificant, perhaps a passing cloud or a distant bird. But high above, American and Australian aircraft were already positioning themselves, hidden by clouds and waiting for the perfect moment. The calm of the Bismarck Sea was about to be shattered in a way no one aboard the convoy could have imagined. It began with the roar of engines, faint at first, growing louder with every passing second. Low-flying fighter-bombers descended from the clouds, weaving between the convoy ships with deadly precision. Machine guns opened fire, cutting swaths through the decks and superstructures. Men scrambled for cover, some barely registering the sudden chaos as bullets tore through the air around them. Soldiers who had moments ago been counting down the hours to landfall now faced an unimaginable reality. The ocean itself had become a battlefield. Then the bombers struck. B-25 Mitchells approached from the flanks, releasing bombs designed to skip across the water and crash into the sides of the transport ships. The technique, called skip bombing, was deadly effective. Ships erupted in flames almost instantly. Explosions ripped through ammunition stores, sending plumes of smoke high into the sky and showering debris across the waves. The convoy's escorts, powerful destroyers meant to fend off attackers, were forced to respond while under constant assault. Their anti-aircraft guns belched fire, but the attackers were swift, coordinated, and relentless. Every maneuver by the Japanese ships was anticipated. Every attempt to regroup met with new waves of bombs and bullets. The chaos was nearly total. Transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers were engulfed in fire within minutes. Soldiers trapped in the hold screamed, some trying desperately to break through the hatch covers, others leaping into the water in panic. The ocean itself became a killing ground. Flames danced on the surface, mingling with oil slicks and debris as the wounded and the desperate struggled to survive. The roar of engines, the crash of explosions, the screams of men, all combined into a symphony of terror that would be seared into memory for those who survived.
Some destroyers attempted to maneuver to protect the convoy and engage the aircraft, but the attack was too coordinated, too precise. The Allied pilots had practiced their approach, calculated their angles, and timed their strikes to maximize destruction while minimizing risk. One wave of bombers would strike, then climb to reload, while another would follow, cutting off any chance for the Japanese to regroup. In just 15 minutes, what had begun as a confident, organized convoy became a scene of utter destruction. Eyewitness accounts later described the surreal nature of the assault. Sailors reported watching ships seemingly explode from nowhere, flames leaping into the sky, and men thrown into the water by the force of the blasts. Bombs that missed their target still sent shrapnel into decks that had only moments before been filled with soldiers dreaming of reinforcements and success. Smoke and fire rose so high it could be seen for miles, marking the convoy's final moments in a theater of war that stretched across the Pacific. Amid the destruction, some acts of bravery emerged. Sailors manned the anti-aircraft guns with determination, officers tried to maintain order, and a few soldiers managed to free themselves from burning holds to help the wounded. But these small victories were dwarfed by the overwhelming force of the attack. In less than an hour, thousands of Japanese troops were killed, wounded, or trapped in the water, while their ships sank beneath the waves. The fleet that had departed with such confidence was now scattered, burning, and broken. The tactical success of the attack was devastating. Allied intelligence had not only anticipated the convoy's movements, but had effectively neutralized one of Japan's major reinforcement operations. The Bismarck Sea had become a crucible where air power proved its dominance over traditional naval formations. This battle demonstrated how coordination, preparation, and intelligence could allow aircraft to annihilate ships before they even reached their destination. This was a turning point not only in New Guinea, but in the larger Pacific campaign. Even as the smoke cleared and the attacking planes withdrew, the aftermath was overwhelming. Fires still burned on floating wreckage, and survivors clung to debris or tried to swim to safety. Rescue operations would save some, but the scale of the loss was staggering. Thousands of men had perished in mere minutes, leaving an indelible mark on the history of naval warfare. For the Japanese, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a humbling, catastrophic lesson in the power of modern air attacks. For the Allies, it was proof that intelligence, planning, and air power could decisively shape the outcome of war. And yet, even in the midst of such destruction, the ocean continued its indifferent rhythm. Waves lapped against burning hulls, gulls circled above wreckage, and distant clouds drifted silently over a sea that had witnessed one of the most lethal air attacks in history. Within 15 minutes, an entire convoy had been shattered, thousands of lives lost, and the course of the Pacific War shifted forever. The Lae Convoy disaster had transformed from a Japanese reinforcement mission into a testament to the devastating effectiveness of intelligence-driven air power.
The sea was quiet now, but the calm was deceptive. Smoke still rose from the burning wrecks, curling into the sky like dark fingers reaching for the clouds. The roar of engines and the thunder of explosions had faded, leaving only the sound of waves lapping against debris and the cries of the wounded drifting across the Bismarck Sea. Thousands of men, once confident in the security of their convoy, now faced a nightmare of survival. Some clung to pieces of wreckage, their uniforms soaked, their faces streaked with oil and blood. Others struggled against exhaustion, waves tossing them violently, carrying away their strength along with the shattered remnants of the fleet. The human cost of the disaster was staggering. Within minutes, more than 7,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed or trapped in the fiery inferno that had consumed the transport ships. Entire units, trained and ready for combat, were erased in a matter of moments. The sea, which had seemed a pathway to salvation, had become a graveyard. For the Japanese High Command, the loss was not just numerical, it was a psychological blow. Troops who had survived the initial strike were left traumatized, witnessing comrades burned alive or swept away by the waves. Morale, already fatigued from the struggle in New Guinea, plummeted further. Rescue efforts began immediately, though they were chaotic and limited. Some destroyers attempted to save survivors, pulling men from the water and throwing life rings to those clinging to debris, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed any organized response. The survivors were cold, burned, and weak from shock. Their voices called out across the water, some pleading for help, others screaming in despair. The ocean, which had been a battlefield moments before, had now become a harsh, indifferent test of endurance. Ships that remained afloat were badly damaged, hulls were breached, steering mechanisms jammed, and fire still burned across many decks. The Japanese escorts, their confidence shattered, struggled to regroup. Some attempted to form defensive positions, but the attackers were already gone, leaving a trail of destruction that could not be easily repaired. The convoy that had sailed with such ambition and expectation was now a fragmented collection of wreckage, drifting aimlessly in a vast, unforgiving sea. The aftermath of the attack sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Reports of the disaster reached headquarters in Rabaul and Tokyo, where officers were forced to confront the magnitude of the loss. Reinforcement plans had been obliterated in a single calculated assault. The commanders who had orchestrated the convoy faced not only questions of accountability, but also the harsh reality that the Allies had achieved something unprecedented. Air power, guided by intelligence, had proven capable of annihilating an entire fleet before it could fulfill its mission. For the survivors, the experience was transformative. Some managed to cling to floating debris for hours, driven by sheer willpower, waiting for rescue. Others were rescued by passing ships or reached the shore of New Guinea, exhausted, hungry, and in shock. Many would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. The flames, the explosions, the screams, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness as thousands of comrades perished around them. It was a stark lesson in the brutal reality of war, one that emphasized how quickly fortune could turn on a single moment of vulnerability. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. News of the disaster undermined Japanese morale throughout the region. Soldiers, already fatigued from months of fighting in New Guinea, now faced the reality that supply lines were no longer secure, that reinforcements could be destroyed before they even arrived, and that the Allies were capable of striking with terrifying precision. The Lae Convoy disaster demonstrated a new vulnerability in Japanese military strategy, one that would shape planning, deployment, and defensive tactics for months to come. Meanwhile, Allied forces celebrated the success, but the victory came with its own awareness of the human cost of war. Pilots and crews returned to base, their aircraft marked with evidence of the engagement, spent ammunition, shattered glass, and torn fuselage panels. Reports were filed detailing the destruction of the convoy, the number of ships sunk, and the approximate casualties. Intelligence officers analyzed every photograph, every intercepted signal, and every pilot report to ensure that the lessons of the battle were fully understood. The operation was hailed as a triumph of preparation, coordination, and strategy, a model for future assaults across the Pacific. In the days that followed, the sea slowly reclaimed the wreckage. Charred hulls sank beneath the waves, leaving only debris and oil slicks in their wake. Survivors were evacuated, many physically uninjured but mentally scarred. For the Japanese, the loss of the Lae Convoy forced a reevaluation of supply operations.
Future reinforcements would require greater secrecy, more coordination, and an understanding that air power had the potential to dominate the oceans in ways that surface ships alone could not counter. The disaster was a turning point, a lesson written in fire, water, and the lives of thousands. Yet amidst the tragedy, stories of courage persisted. Sailors risked their own lives to save comrades. Soldiers maintained discipline in the chaos long enough to help the wounded reach flotation devices. These small acts of humanity, performed under the most extreme circumstances, provided a stark contrast to the overwhelming devastation. They reminded the survivors and historians alike that even in moments of utter destruction, the human spirit could endure, and sometimes it could prevail. The Lae Convoy disaster was more than a military defeat. It was a human tragedy, a logistical failure, and a vivid demonstration of how war had changed in the Pacific. Ships, strategies, and even thousands of soldiers could be obliterated in minutes by intelligence-guided air attacks. For Japan, it was a bitter lesson in vulnerability. For the Allies, it was proof that preparation, coordination, and courage in the air could rewrite the rules of naval warfare. And for the survivors, it was a day that would never be forgotten, the day when the Bismarck Sea became both battlefield and grave.
The Battle of the Bismarck Sea did not end when the last Japanese ship sank beneath the waves. Its impact reverberated far beyond the immediate devastation, sending shockwaves through the Japanese high command and reshaping the way naval warfare would be conducted in the Pacific. For the Allies, it confirmed a lesson that had been emerging since the early days of the war. Air power, when guided by intelligence and precision, could dominate the seas in ways previously unimaginable. The Japanese, reeling from the loss of thousands of men and dozens of ships, were forced to confront a brutal reality. Their supply lines, which had once seemed secure, were now exposed. Reinforcements and provisions could be annihilated before they even reached the front lines. The concept of a safe passage for convoys was no longer viable. For commanders planning future operations, the lesson was stark. Speed and escort alone were not enough. The skies were now as lethal as the waters themselves, and ignoring this fact would invite disaster. In the months following the Lae Convoy disaster, Japanese strategy began to shift. Supply convoys were rerouted, escorted more heavily, or disguised to avoid detection. But the fundamental challenge remained. Allied aircraft had proven that intelligence, planning, and precision strikes could render even the strongest convoy vulnerable. The loss at Bismarck Sea became a cautionary tale, one that would influence Japanese operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The confidence of a fleet no longer guaranteed survival. Vulnerability had become the new norm. For the Allies, the battle reinforced the value of coordinated intelligence and air operations. Code-breaking, reconnaissance, and careful planning had combined to produce one of the most decisive victories of the Pacific theater. The destruction of the Lae Convoy was not a matter of luck or chance. It was the result of months of preparation, meticulous calculation, and the skill of pilots who executed complex attack formations with precision under fire. The success of the operation demonstrated that air superiority could dictate the outcome of naval engagements, a principle that would shape Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese soldiers and commanders were reminded of their vulnerability and the growing dominance of Allied forces in the air. Morale suffered, and the fear of air attacks became a constant concern in planning every operation. Conversely, Allied forces gained a boost in confidence, knowing that their intelligence and tactical innovations could decisively strike even heavily guarded convoys. This momentum would influence subsequent campaigns in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and beyond, as the Allies increasingly relied on air power to disrupt Japanese logistics and supply chains.
The lessons of the Bismarck Sea extended beyond immediate strategy. It was a turning point in the evolution of naval warfare. Traditional doctrines, which had emphasized the protection of convoys through surface warships and the skill of fleet maneuvering, were now challenged by the overwhelming effectiveness of air attacks. The concept of combined arms, the integration of intelligence, air power, and naval strategy, was proven not only viable, but essential. The days when fleets could sail unchallenged in enemy waters were over. Every naval operation had to account for the threat from above. Historians often point to the 15 minutes of devastation during the Lae Convoy attack as a moment that encapsulates the changing nature of World War II. Entire divisions, ships, and supplies could be destroyed in the time it took to read a single report. What had once been measured in days of battle, with careful maneuvering and attrition, could now be decided in a brief, calculated strike from the sky. The psychological shock, the loss of life, and the strategic implications combined to make the Bismarck Sea battle a defining event in the Pacific War. Yet beyond strategy and tactics, the battle also reminds us of the human element. Thousands of men faced unimaginable circumstances, trapped in burning ships, struggling in open water, and witnessing the deaths of comrades. Survivors endured physical injuries and the trauma of witnessing catastrophe on an enormous scale. Their experiences highlight the human cost of strategic decisions, a reminder that history is written not only in maps and statistics, but in the lives of those who lived it. The Lae Convoy disaster was a turning point, not just because of the loss of ships or men, but because it symbolized a shift in the balance of power in the Pacific. Air power had become decisive, intelligence had become an instrument of lethal precision, and the sea, once a vast avenue of transport and maneuver, had become a perilous battlefield where vulnerability could be exploited with deadly effect. In this new reality, the Japanese would find themselves increasingly constrained, while the Allies leveraged their technological, tactical, and intelligence advantages to tighten control over the region. As the war continued, the echoes of Bismarck Sea were felt in every operation involving convoys, reinforcements, and supply lines. The disaster underscored that preparation, coordination, and adaptation were essential to survival. It also demonstrated that boldness without awareness of emerging threats could be catastrophic. In the Pacific, where distances were vast and resources often scarce, the lessons of the Lae Convoy would influence countless decisions, shaping the trajectory of the conflict. And so, when we reflect on the Lae Convoy disaster, it is not only as a tale of destruction, but as a moment when warfare itself changed. 15 minutes of air attack redefined naval strategy. Thousands of lives were lost, but the knowledge gained, the lessons learned, and the demonstration of air power's dominance transformed the course of the Pacific War. In the end, the Bismarck Sea stands as a stark reminder that in modern warfare, the skies can be as deadly as the sea, and that even the strongest fleets are only as secure as the intelligence and strategy that protect them.